We are good to go, so thank you. Well, good morning. Actually, you want to start recording? Okay, so again, welcome this morning. My name is David Vasquez Levy. I serve as president at Pacific School of Religion here in Berkeley, California. And I am joined today by a group of folks who have come together to help us think and talk about ways in which we can stand in solidarity with the community of Standing Rock, and as well as think about the ways that the fight for justice, for the protection of our environment, and for a call to a different way of engaging each other in a time of a lot of anxiety in our society. That we have come to think both about what's happening there, but also out of that to think about what's happening in our own communities. So I'm grateful for your being with us this morning. This is being recorded, so they will be made available later in the day and as a resource as communities seek to respond. This webinar is part of a series of webinars that we are doing at Pacific School of Religion through our Ignite Institute as a way to help resource our congregations and faith communities with ways to think about issues going on right at the moment and how they may be engaged in our worship life, in our educational life, in our activism. So we're grateful for those who join us today to offer their wisdom, reflections, and thoughts about this conversation. We are joined by Patricia St-Onge, who is a founder of 7 Generations Consulting in Oakland and brings over 20 years of experience leading and working with nonprofit and public sector agencies. She will share a bit more, as each of the presenters will, about herself, but Patricia also serves as adjunct faculty here at PSR and is one of the leaders of our Reignite program, which is a late career program aimed at helping folks in their late careers think about ways to engage their lives in social change. We're also joined by Melvin Cobb. Mel is a PSR Masters of Divinity student, a first-year student here, who brings a variety of different background and experiences that he'll share a little bit about as he introduces himself, but he was present at Standing Rock 2 weeks ago, along with a group of other folks here from PSR GTU schools. And we're also joined by Shauna Hannan, who is Associate Professor of Homiletics at Pacific Lutheran Theological Seminary, one of our partner schools in the GTU. Our deep appreciation to Shauna, who has stepped into the conversation very last minute, as Sharon Fenema, Assistant Professor of Christian Worship and Director of Worship Life here at PSR, was arrested this weekend, along with a number of our students and other members of our community. As Erin Burns, our Communications Director here at PSR, said, one of the things I love about my job, she said, is that when people at PSR get arrested, it's usually for protesting something worthwhile. And so that is the case for Sharon, as well as for Todd Whitley, who was going to be in our conversation today, and Nikira Hernandez. The 3 of them, along with 2 other PSR folks, were arrested together with 30 people on Friday as they have been present there at Standing Rock in their efforts, joining the community in their efforts to protect the waters and the rights of the community there. So our prayers are with them as we gather this morning. This group will be arraigned this morning, so we are keeping tabs on how they're doing. But again, Shauna, thank you for joining us. I want to invite you to begin our time together with a brief moment of prayer. So if you please join me in an attitude of prayer. I read the words of the Dakota Instructions for Living. Friend, do it this way. That is, whatever you do in life, do the very best you can with both your heart and mind. And if you do it that way, the power of the universe will come to your assistance if your heart and mind are in unity. When one sits in the hoop of the people, one must be responsible because all of creation is related, and the hurt of one is the hurt of all, and the honor of one is the honor of all. Whatever we do affects everything in the universe. These words are passed down from White Buffalo Calf Woman. They are an invitation to think about the ways that we are interconnected to the earth and to one another. We use those words of this Instructions for Living as we sent off our last group that headed to Standing Rock last Tuesday in chapel. Our conversation today is joining a group or a larger conversation that has in reality been going on for over 100 years, much longer, significantly much longer. And we are joining in our conversation today 300 Native American tribes that have flocked to join with activists and calling on others to come together in what has been characterized as the most diverse tribal action in at least 1 century, perhaps since Little Bighorn. It is important that as people of faith, both across the United States and around the world, and people of conviction, that we be attentive to this gathering, because it represents not only what's happening in that particular community, but in that particularity, it reflects issues that affect all of our communities around the world. Last Monday, a week ago today, we had a delegation from Colombia who came here to PSR. This was a visit following 2 of our visits to Colombia, to these communities. It was a predominantly African community, or African descent community from Colombia, one of 118 communities in Colombia that are fighting for their rights in their communities, that are very similarly concerned for the way that the extraction of minerals, of resources out of our lands impact the lives, particularly of communities of color and communities that are marginalized. So our conversation today joins a very broad group of people coming together. It joins a historical, contextual conversation that Pat will expand on as she introduces it to us. Whether the beginning of the conversation can be placed at many different places, in the discovery of America, in the ways we have thought about land and power. It's certainly, for the particular community of Standing Rock, it has as part of its context, the formation of water dams after World War II that displaced large numbers of Native communities. 9 of the Mandan, Hidasta, and Arikara towns were inundated by the Garrison Dam, and the residents of those communities who were not at the table when the decisions were made were forced to relocate to areas where their traditional way of life and agriculture was virtually impossible. So we join a broad conversation that expands history, it expands the context of Native communities around the United States, but it also expands the realities of displacement and the questions we most wrestle with around economics, around environment, around race. We will engage some of those conversations today, and we will take a moment for each of the panelists to share some reflections, both of context, of the personal experience of being a Standing Rock, as well as some resources that may help us engage this conversation with our communities. So I'll turn it over to Patricia St. Ange to begin our conversation. If you'll introduce yourself a little bit more, Patricia, thank you for being with us, and share some of your, help us understand the context.
Sego Aguego, Patricia Tano Ikuk Peshni Ichuwi Yonyats. Hi everybody, my name is Patricia. I'm Mohawk and French Canadian, and I'm adopted Cheyenne River Lakota. My family is at Standing Rock and has been since April when things started there for this round. But you're right, David, I appreciate you contextualizing this in a long river. And the place where I thought I'd dip my foot this morning is at 1491. There was a papal bull called the Doctrine of Discovery. And it was in that doctrine that the church, on behalf of the monarchs of Europe, told the explorers who were heading out after just decimating the Moors and expelling the Jews from Spain, they went out into the rest of the world. And they were told in this doctrine that any land that they saw, they could claim for the crown. And then if they met any people there, they would convert them, and if they wouldn't convert, then they could enslave them. So they came here with this sense of power and authority that, in my opinion, really stripped away their capacity for curiosity and openness. And so the movement of the settlers across the United States that doctrine of discovery got embedded in manifest destiny. So there's been throughout this journey the sense that God was guiding something that was devastating to the communities all along the way. And so it's a really important warning for us, I think, to be careful about how we understand God moving in our lives and in the world. And throughout the next 3 centuries, there were a series of treaties between what eventually became the US government and the nations who were already here. And the treaties of 1852 and 1861 are specifically treaties that were made with the Lakota people, and much of the land on which the pipeline is being built was unceded land. That land technically still belongs to the Lakota people. But the good news is that along with all of that river, there's been an equally powerful legacy of resistance. And so from the very beginning, I love that you started with the original instructions of the Lakota people, because most indigenous nations have very similar instructions that say, we're all related. We are all in relationship. And in fact, we're the youngest of the relatives on the earth. And so it's an invitation to humility and to acknowledging that there's a lot of wisdom in the world that we don't have, and that by being in right relationship, we can cultivate it. So the Energy Transfer Partners is the company who started the pipeline, who's placing the pipeline. And they were very clever in that they applied for very small pieces of the project rather than applying for permits for the whole project, which would require significant environmental review and public comment. So there's a specific law, and I can't remember what it's called, but it's designed, if you want to put a little dock in a river by your house, it's that kind of project that it covers. But they use that to create thousands of little projects for this pipeline that are less than an acre or whatever the rules are in that law. And by doing that, they were able to lay the whole pipeline except for these last feet yards, whatever it is, that will take it under the Missouri River. And it was there that the Standing Rock Sioux tribe recognized what was happening and said, we have to say no to this. And that happened in April of this year. It's grown. And in June, they called on other people to come, and people have been coming steadily since then. And then the state violence really has been low grade throughout the whole thing. There's been a checkpoint since the beginning. And if you look Indian, you don't get to pass through. And if you don't, you can go through. And now they're stopping pretty much everybody. And it's escalating, as we've seen on the news, to where, to one of the more recent things, they were using rubber bullets and sonic booms and all kinds of things. And they wounded a 16-year-old significantly enough that he's been in the hospital, and his horse had to be killed. So resistance is also strengthening. So there's this dance between violence on the part of the state and the resistance to it that I think gives us a lot of room for hope and courage. I want to just say a word about my family that's there. There are 4 generations of the feather necklace, Tiospaye, which means extended family. And they also are longtime veterans of resistance. They were at Alcatraz, they were at Wounded Knee, and I'm really grateful to have been adopted into that family. And I feel like they're they're showing us a way, along with other folks there, they're showing us what it looks like to be deeply and profoundly committed for the long haul. And so I'll leave it there, and when we come around again, see if there are questions, or unless you want to check, you want me to cover anything else.
Just give an opportunity to each of you to kind of share a little bit of, sorry, I think I'm muted. Oh, there we go. So thank you. We will turn it to Mel Cobb. Again, I am the student here who was out at Standing Rock just a couple of weeks ago to share a little bit about your experience, Mel, when you were there, and maybe a little bit about how you, what motivated you to join this this effort of resistance and to travel there, to be there.
Good morning, everyone. Wow, this was just wrong on so many planes, and I was called to action after watching several of the news feeds on Facebook, and it was reminiscent of some of the civil rights actions during the 60s. I particularly was moved or disturbed by the fact that they began using canines on the protesters there, again, reminiscent of some of the actions that took place in the 60s. And so as I began praying, you know, I could hear my ancestors saying, we didn't pray, we got out, we protested, we made a way for you to be here and to do what you're doing. You need to pay that back. And so having said that, and having had that conversation with God and myself and my obviously my cohort here at PSR, we decided to take action, and to, as a matter of fact, just in a matter of about 48 hours, 24 hours, decided that we would leave and we would be on our way there to do what we could. And just about that time, actually, there was a call that came up from Father Dan Floberg over at St. James Episcopal Church there in Cannonball, asking for the clergy to come and support. So initially he asked that 100 clergy persons come to support the efforts, and that was our final invitation, or our final lead into knowing that this is what we need to do. A group of us, both from PSR and Star King School of Ministry, a total of 8 persons, made the journey, 1,700 miles, about 30 hours driving time, and arrived there. And again, our experience is a little bit different from my cohort that's there now. We had to actually sign off saying that we would not, as clergy, we would not interact with the protesters, and that we would also not interact with law enforcement there. So I can't speak on being on the front line of things, but however, those of us who went as clergy persons, we arrived a few days early, so we were able to receive the other clergy persons that were coming in. I think if I never see a ham and turkey sandwich again, I'll be happy. We made about 1,500 sandwiches, and we packed about 1,500 brown bag lunches, so that clergy who were coming from around the country and some from abroad would not be hungry and be without. We braved the wonderful cold floor of St. James Episcopal Church there, as again, those were our accommodations. So we had a couple of things that happened when we arrived there. We were briefed about what was going on. We had a training session as to what was to be expected of us the following day during the march. And so moving forward to the actual day of the march, there was a ceremonious burning of the doctrine of discovery, Patricia, which I found quite moving. I think if my memory serves me correct, there were about 24 faith traditions that were called into place there to have a copy of that doctrine of discovery. And we handed it to the elders there, and they decided that they weren't going to put into the sacrificial fire. I may term that wrong, Patricia, but there's a fire there they're basically using as kind of a sacrificial fire, or a sacred fire, should I say? Sacred fire, Sacred fire, sorry. That they were going to put the documents into, again, to say that for once and for all, we, as not only as a nation, the tribe did not respect that document, but again, as a religious community, we were not going to no longer honor or respect that document as well. So that was quite moving. We proceeded from there to actually walk up towards the area of conflict, just there at the Missouri River. There's a bridge, and The walk-in itself began by singing hymns. Everyone was dressed in their traditional, whatever their clothing would have been, the robes or the type of vestment, shall I say, for the march, in the march rather. We moved forward. Lots of speakers, people came up and denouncing the actions of the pipeline movement. We were met again with some of the folk from the Lakota tribe. I think this probably is my most heartwarming experience or remembrance, is that being met by some of the local people who said, you know, thank you for coming. That the tensions had been so high, and just the fact that we were there, we were in prayer, we were in song, how it changed the atmosphere. We could even notice that they could even point out how law enforcement was reacting and kind of standing down and kind of relaxing quite a bit. The young man you spoke of the day before we arrived, he had just been hit by the rubber bullet. I think in actuality, after having killed his horse, the young man now has some type of lung damage from a rubber bullet. So bullets of any sort shouldn't be allowed. But again, that's one of the things that we were met with, that the day we arrived, the young man had been shot with a rubber bullet and now has some type of lung damage and will have some long-term effects from the whole experience that he's been a part of there. So as time went on, we kind of just basically, again, kind of spent the day after we'd done kind of the praise and worship service, we'll call it that, kind of speaking with the local people, and they kind of shared their stories with us about what this meant, and long-termly, what it might mean, just not for them as people, but all of those who find home and life along the Missouri River. We, again, just kind of, as a group, just kind of stayed in prayer, kind of fellowship, and thought, what can we do collectively here back at PSR and we're trying to reach out in its entirety to the GTU, and find out how we can, again, continue with supporting these efforts. Again, being a man of color, I have a great debt to repay to those who've gone on before me, and so I wholeheartedly stand with my brothers and sisters there in Cannonball, at Standing Rock, and the surrounding areas. And so we're, again, still a conversation here, trying to see what more can we do. And our love and prayers are with those of my cohorts that are there at Standing Rock now as well. Go, Dr. Fineman.
Thank you, Mel. I very much appreciate it. And it's interesting to think about the context, or between this doctrine of discovery, that where the church has a role in the exclusion, oppression of many others. And so the responsibility we bear as people of faith, inheritors of those traditions, to think about how we engage. And there's significant complexity about how we ought to respond and how we engage in ways that do not perpetuate some of that interventionism, some of that exclusionism that is our legacy. And so definitely thoughtful engagement is significant. Value the importance of social media. It creates, your invitation, AML, comes from finally seeing these images on Facebook. How do we use social media to create networks that respond to issues that are global? Many of the issues we are facing, part of what we're recognizing is the global nature of much of our challenges, the connections around the world. And because the causes of many of our issues, whether they are economic, whether they are racism, whether they are environmental challenges, the factors that cause them certainly have global power and global presence. Therefore, our solidarity and our work in response needs to also become more broadly connected, certainly around the country and around the world. So thank you for sharing your experience and reflections there. Shauna, we'll turn it to you again. If you can say a bit more about yourself, and then share with us some ways in which our congregations might be able to engage that. This coming Sunday is Christ the King Sunday, and many congregations that follow the Revised Common Lectionary, and so those texts might provide some opportunities for us to engage as well.
Yeah, sure. Well, thank you very much, David, for this invitation. You had asked us to say a little bit more about ourselves just at the beginning, and I guess I'll say that I've just been here at PLTS. This is my third year connected with the GTU, and there's just something about this relationship in these schools that's amazing. And then learning from you and Patricia and Mel, I've already learned in these 20 minutes or so, some things. So that's a real gift. Thank you very much. Folks who are joining, we're expecting Sharon Fenema, and I hope that just because she's not here right now, you will make an effort to hear from her and see what she has to say about this. But let me offer just a few things about what I think we might do as leaders in congregations and other communities of faith to bring this to our attention, to participate in acts of resistance, if only liturgical acts of resistance. I think it can be powerful. And I'll say that if there's anything that I say that doesn't sit well or isn't right in the Q&A, please feel free to push against that. I'm open to that. Again, I'm learning. So I will say though, David, when you called on Friday and asked me to think about this, the next day I had a conversation with my parents in Minnesota. And I said, oh, hey, I'm doing this thing on Monday. I was telling them that within 3 minutes, they were both on their computers in the same room, looking things up on the internet about Standing Rock and just saying, yeah, we've heard about that, but maybe we should know a little bit more. So by just having this webinar, by you inviting me, by me naming that and speaking about it to my parents, it brought a different kind of attention, at least to 2 more people who might not otherwise pay attention. So I think that's kind of the first thing, that to ignore this in worship is a problem. To name it and to speak about it, even minimally, is an act of resistance. It's a start. And so I think that's the first thing. And for us as worship leaders to figure out how will it have a role, if only minimally. Secondly, I teach preaching primarily. And so one of the courses I teach is preaching public issues. And people come into that course either utterly gung-ho or kind of wary, or actually it's an elective, so they don't have to take it. So it's usually the gung-ho kind of folks, right? But they're worried about how their congregation will receive that. Why would we even mention these things in preaching? And I guess the first thing I would say is because our foundation for preaching, for some of us, is the Bible, which is an act of resistance, so that itself compels us to say something. And then the question is how. And I think we have to break down whatever it is our traditional understanding of what preaching is, and do something new or perhaps ancient. And that is to go back to understanding preaching as a conversation. And the word homeleo, the Greek word that you find in the story of the road to Emmaus in Luke 24, means conversation. When Jesus and his disciples are walking along that road, they are homeleoing, having conversation. And so I think, in a way, if we can think about preaching as Lucy Atkinson Rose has said, as a proposal that invites counter proposals. So that when I stand up and I preach and I name something that's going on, like at Standing Rock, I have to provide space for other voices to ask questions or to participate in that conversation. That's a different way of thinking about preaching. That doesn't mean we're not prophetic. That doesn't mean we don't have something to say that's powerful. But it's more powerful when you invite that conversation to continue. I also think about sermon illustrations, and we often, and this would be really great to do, to quote, let's say, Patricia or Mel, or I suspect you're going to say something, David, that's going to be just quotable in our sermons on Sunday, or maybe something on Facebook, and we say, well, I heard David Vasquez Levy say, well, what would it look like if you actually let your voice come into the sermon? Speaking of social media or media in our congregations, why would I quote you? Why wouldn't I just take this recording and let you speak? And one example I thought of was, is it David Archambault? Is this how you say? Yeah, is speaking at the UN. It's a minute and a half. I could refer to that powerful speech, what I thought was a powerful speech, or why wouldn't I just hit play? And let's let his voice come into worship. And frankly, I think the conversation begins before we preach. let's send out an email to our congregation and say, I have to name something that's going on at Standing Rock. And I want you to know about this. And I'm interested, before Sunday morning, I'm interested in what you think. What are the powerful things you've been hearing about that? What are your questions? Mm-hmm. And then there's got to be a place after the fact. So I hope you get what I'm saying, that it's a conversation. Mm-hmm. You set something in place for people to be able to have ears to hear, rather than block their
right.
ears, and then continue that conversation. So those are a couple of ideas. This Sunday, the Revised Common Lectionary, one of the Psalm options is Psalm 46. And there's some wonderful creation imagery there. Verse 4 of Psalm 46, there's a river whose streams make glad the city of God, the holy habitation of the Most High. There's a lot of water imagery. It might be a good Sunday to affirm our baptism, and in that baptism, we are called to justice and peacemaking. And what's one way we live that out? We're doing what Mel did. We're doing what Sharon and the students are doing. That's one way to live that out. So we can name how baptism, in our baptism is connected to these acts of resistance, is connected to these bodies of water. That's the nourishment and the life-giving source for the people at Standing Rock. We name Lake Oahu. We name the Missouri River in our prayers. Just a couple of other things. One thing we did at PLTS, our worship leaders led us in a time where they laid out a map of the world on the floor. So they didn't have it on the wall, which I normally would think putting a map up on the wall and then you put some things up, but as a kind of a liturgical rite, they had a map. And as we sang, people could go and light a candle and then place the candle on a part of the world that is especially in their hearts and minds. And if they could be, they can't all be there right in that moment, but you're placing the candle there. What if it would look like if we had that and everybody placed some kind of candle on the Dakotas, right in that place? We channeled that light, that energy there. There could be some liturgical power in that. So that's maybe a concrete liturgical rite that I learned from the worship planners at our school at PLTS this last week. And finally, I think I learned just a moment ago that there's something we could do about that document of discovery. Bring that to people's attention. There's no reason why that same ritual of burning that couldn't take place. And so just in this conversation, I'm learning from you what we could do. So I'll throw out those things as possibilities for now.
Thank you, Shauna. Thank you, Mel. Thank you, Pat. Let me offer a few reflections myself, and then we'll open it up for some conversation. We'll see if we have questions on the line, and otherwise just engage each other in questions as well. I do think, there is a power to this image of taking something like the Doctrine of Discovery and just reading portions of it, so we realize how the church has had a significant role. We cannot, our absence of conversation is conversation itself. And so we need to be aware of the way that, again, this is an inheritance for us about the role of religious communities and faith, which calls us to attentiveness and cultural humility about how we engage a conversation like this. A couple of comments I want to make, in terms of things or ways to engage this on Sunday morning. I was in a conversation on Saturday with a friend who is a pastor right outside of Bismarck, where some of those who from the group here from PSR that went and were arrested are at. So I was calling her to ask her to go visit one of the folks who was detained in the jail, and then we got into a conversation. She's a pastor at one of the jails, or a chaplain at one of the jails there, and she talked about a ritual that she has been using significantly in this conversation, because her congregation is both, half of it is within the jail and half of it is outside. They did just a talking circle. For many of you, you may be aware or familiar with this tradition within many Native American communities that focuses on the importance of listening to one another And so that you take some sacred object, it can be a sacred, a talking feather, it can be a talking stick, and people who are holding it have the opportunity to speak, and others are really not just waiting to respond and jump in, but really openly listening this conversation that Shauna has reminded us of. And so is that the way to have the conversation around this? For her, that was important, particularly as she tries to minister in a very divided community. The non-native community in the Dakotas is seeing much of this experience right now through the eyes of their economic well-being, whether it's the farmers who have much at stake for that pipeline to run through their land because that will generate resources for them, whether it is getting oil off the rails of the trains so that more grain can go on those rails. That's part of the way they're engaged in this. And so there's economic complexity to how we're thinking about this. And so how do we engage this conversation in a way that allows us to say there's a way forward for all of us in this together that can be respectful? How do we acknowledge the fact that the pipeline was already moved once in order to move it away from Bismarck, where the predominant white community lives, and moving it closer to the native community? How do we recognize that there is issues here that have to do with environment and our communities of color? Now, why, as Shauna has said, would we do this in worship? It's far away, it's not us, and why am I going to get into a conversation like this? Well, this Sunday's readings, again, in many congregations that follow the Revised Common Lectionary, this Sunday will be Christ the King Sunday. I mean, this is a Sunday that really challenges both the church's heritage of the legacy of discovery, of equating power with the church, but what kind of king is Jesus? In the lectionary for this Christ the King Sunday, we read, for those who will be doing that, we'll be reading from the Gospel of Luke chapter 23 and looking at the crucifixion of this king. So when it comes to a time of conflict, where is God in this moment of power? Well, in the Christian tradition, as it is also in many other traditions, we find God specifically on the side of the oppressed, on the side of the protesters, and putting his very body on the line, literally, for those who have been displaced and to be able to name the challenges that he sees. The other reading for this Sunday is really significant, which is from Jeremiah 23, and it's a text that talks about the role of religious leaders as shepherds. And it begins with a warning that I think we must heed. Woe to the shepherds who destroy and scatter the sheep of my pasture. So Jeremiah is speaking to the religious leaders and to the political leaders of the nation that have failed, really, their communities, and calling them to account. And so how do we hear that call to account, particularly in the wake of our own election recently, that really is raising questions for us about what the role of our leadership will be and how do we hold our leadership accountable to the well-being of our communities. The text continues on to speak about a promised vision. So Pat reminded us of this long legacy, not only of exclusion, but also of resistance and of leadership that is different. The text in Jeremiah has some beautiful language that can really shape our preaching when it says, I will raise up shepherds over them who will shepherd them, and they shall not fear any longer. So how do we speak in a way that allows us, in a moment of a lot of fear, to speak that gospel good news, that every time there is an encounter between the divine and a human, it always begins with the words, do not be afraid. The final thing I will say is that, as Shauna mentioned as well, this is an opportunity for us to pay attention and to learn. There are a lot of articles published today. LA Times has a really good piece on what's happening at Standing Rock. There's a lot of ways for us, because of technology, to be able to understand fairly quickly at least some of the contextual reality of what's happening. But if you want to go a little bit more in depth, one of the recommendations I got from this friend who is a pastor in the Dakotas was a book called Coyote Warrior. Coyote Warrior, One Man, Three Tribes, and the Trial That Forged a Nation by Paul van de Velde. A lot of these resources will be available on our website if you want to look at it. But that book really provides in-depth contextual reality of the struggle in that region, taking the story of Raymond Cross, who is a Yale-educated attorney, youngest son of Martin Cross. Martin Cross was an American Native tribal chairman who spent the bulk of his life fighting a losing battle, ultimately, against the construction of the dams that displaced many people in the very same region where Standing Rock is now. So those are some reflections to offer around text. And so let's take a few minutes to have some conversation with each other. We'll turn it first to Leslie to see if there's any questions that folks have submitted. And otherwise, I'm sure we each have perhaps questions of each other or comments to make. Leslie, I think you're muted.
Yep. Just setting up. If you have a question down in the bottom, you'll see a Q&A and you can enter your questions there. Feel free to enter any kind of questions you might have of the panelists. Right now we don't have any questions from people.
So while those come in, let me invite Pat to comment on something. You may have other comments you want to make, Pat, but one thing that came up to me right away is what would you say are appropriate ways for communities outside of the immediate area, like we are here, to be engaged? And what are the things we should be mindful of, in terms of appropriate engagement?
Yeah, thank you. The Indigenous Environmental Network and the tribe are sending out notices of what they need and what they don't need. And they're asking people, so you can find those on social media. If you go to the Indigenous Environmental Network Facebook page, they do regular updates there. I think the key, I really appreciate Mel mentioning that the clergy came in an attitude of prayer, because that's the focus of the whole resistance, is to be prayerful and nonviolent. They start every morning with sunrise ceremony, and they're finding that there are some folks who come who don't understand enough about Indigenous culture, and they're being there's some challenges with being disrespectful to elders. And in our communities, elders are highly respected. There's a sense of individual accomplishment and pride in what we're doing as individual people. And Indigenous culture is a collective culture. It's not, we do individual things in order to locate ourselves within the larger context, rather than for our personal aggrandizement, or that's maybe too harsh, but I think that's a really critical thing, that people understand that they're coming there to be part of a community that already exists, that already has established protocols, and connecting, as folks did, Mel and his crew did, connecting with local people in conversation. So you can see the thread of what we've said this morning is all really important for people to pay attention to. The other thing is that, as you mentioned, the people from Colombia, there are peoples all over the world who are struggling to protect water, land, air even. It's all become commodified. And so participating wherever we are in those actions is helpful. And then just one little point, Mel, you talked about canines and being reminiscent of the 60s, and absolutely the role of media. If we hadn't had those dogs on TV in the 60s, who knows what it would have happened with the civil rights movement. And I just want to remind people that Columbus came with dogs that were unleashed on the people he met here, and that in the California missions, they actually used dogs to kill gay people. It was a very much a spiritual and political strategy to use dogs. And so I think we ought to pray for dogs, because their natural inclination is not to behave that way. And so when people use them that way, I think it creates dissonance for the dogs as well as for the people that they're unleashed on. And then the last thing I would say is I would recommend another book that's not about the Dakotas in particular, but it's a beautiful expression of what Indigenous culture looks like in the world, and it's called Braiding Sweetgrass, and it's by Robin Wall Kimmerer. And so I really appreciate the thread that feels like it's been woven through this, and want to make room for other folks to talk as well.
Thank you, Pat. Yeah, Mel.
Something I neglected, a very important point I neglected to mention is that when we got the call to come out to stand on his clergy, he asked that 100 persons come to support him. Ironically, at last tally, 542 people, 542 clergy persons had actually registered and shown up. So there may have been some there who were not registered. And he related that to, that's how many years it's been since the doctrine of discovery had actually been in. So I neglected to show.
That's a powerful image. Mel, can you speak a little bit about white clergy specifically, and what difference does that make? Well,
I truly, you could feel the spirit of the Dakota people there. And so as Patricia just stated, that they're very spiritual people, and they believe in prayer. And however we see God, whatever path you call God, that is your path. And so I don't question that. But truly there's a sense that you could feel the pain, you could feel the hurt, you could feel the disappointment, and certainly you could feel their spirits. And so that was just kind of the avenue that I think that was for, and I feel that Father Fogelberg was so in touch with the people there, so in tune with them and all of their pain, that he knew, again, whether it was his inclination or given from above, it was this time for that thing to happen. So
that's very powerful. Thank you. We have very particular context for this conversation today, given the way that the presidential campaign both revealed and exacerbated deep divisions within our nation. The vote itself in the end has raised just a flurry of and a painful conversation nationally around many of these issues. Can each of you kind of reflect a little bit about how you are navigating the particularity of the situation in the broader context of a national conversation, some of the challenges we're facing as a nation?
Maybe I'll just say one thing about that. David, your image of when you brought up the talking stick and the need for deep listening, that recognition of the divide, I don't know, really stirs me to listen. Like, have I not been listening? You know, do I just assume that everybody's coming at this the same way I do? And that assumption is not helpful. So that really to pray for the words, when should I speak? What should I say? But mostly, how should I listen? And how do I listen deeply, and not simply to wait for my turn to jump in? These elections have been, it's been painful, but I also am prompted to deep listening. So that, and that's hard because I want to say more. But really what I have to say maybe isn't as important, and surely isn't as important as the next person. So how do I participate in that? And feel like it is participation. To listen is to participate.
So yeah, I appreciate that, and having shared the idea of the, or the experience of the talking circle from this pastor in Bismarck, I've also been wrestling, and Pat, I don't know if you want to speak to this, or for you, Mel, as well, either, any of you. How do we do this, listening to each other while recognizing the inequality of power and voice? Yeah. We have such dominant strength and inequality, even in this particular instance, between the resources. We're talking about a $3.8 billion project, with lots of resources behind it, and then including right now much of the government support for it. What does it mean to listen to one another? Even as I think about going around the circle, I mean, there's a lot of people around the circle with a bigger stick, So how do we balance that need for listening to one another while also privileging perhaps some of the voices that currently are not?
David, one of the questions that we had the opportunity to be interviewed by several news outlets throughout the country, and I think NPR and a few others spoke with me and compared the action I was taking there with that of Black Lives Matters. And I was saddened by the fact that they did compare the two, as if to try to get me to say one was more important than the other. My response is that injustice is injustice. And the Bible reminds us that there's a season for everything. And so this is a season that we come forward and we stand with our brothers and sisters there at Standing Rock. And so having given it some more thought, I would, at some point in time, I hope that we might have an action such as that we put out a call for clergy persons from around the nation to come and converge on DC or some other given spot. But again, I just had to kind of hold my real tongue, and when I was asked to kind of pit the two against each other, and I wanted no parts of that, because again, I just think that injustice is injustice, whomever it falls upon.
And that's usually one of the ways, if we go back to the history that Patricia was highlighting in the missions, in the role that Columbus had, that the dividing of people against each other was critical and central to that strategy, to try to pit one against the other, both of which are predicated on the centrality of one group. So the assumption is we are all trying to get towards the center, and there's only a certain amount of a pie. And so whoever gets access to it means somebody else is excluded from it, but it's all predicated on the assumption that there is a center, and that center has historically been framed around the communities that have most power. So, yeah. But Patricia, were you gonna say something?
Yeah. In terms of my response to the election, on a pretty fundamental level, this is who we are as a nation. We, the people, didn't include most of us on this webinar. It was landed gentry. So Donald Trump has been, and his folks like him have been we in the development of this country from the very beginning. So what we need to do, I think, is tell the real story of the United States, that it's not love, peace, justice for all, and liberty and equality and all of those things that have become our national narrative, but that it's conquest and slavery and misogyny. And until we can tell that story, we can't heal it. And so I think this gives us an opportunity to bring that story more profoundly to the surface. There's been a thread of people trying to tell that story all along. And I also think that there are many kinds of power. We think about power as the kind of power over and the dominant, positional power, and that's very real, and we want to engage it. But there's also collective power and cultural power. There's many kinds of power. And the beauty of this movement and Black Lives Matter and the Dreamers and all of the resistance movements that are active now, immigrant rights, is that people are seeing their power. Even if they don't have positional power, they're finding power collectively. And that, I think, as we increase that, will increase our capacity to stand in relationship to the power over, so that it all heals. There's this beautiful young woman at Standing Rock who led a healing march to the sheriff's office, and they've done amazing things. They've told the police officers they were praying for them. They've shared water with them. They've done things, and I heard that 27 police officers have decided that they can't stand on that line anymore. And some of them have turned their badges in, and some have said, I just can't do this on that particular. And then the last thing I'll say, Mel, I appreciate the tension of people wanting to make Black Lives Matter and Standing Rock two different things, but the same energy that created both of those situations needs to be engaged and healed. And so the shorthand, Ulali is a fabulous musical group, and they have a song called Going Home. And one of the phrases in that song just moves me. It's stolen people on stolen land.
Mm-hmm.
And so those two issues in particular are inextricable. They really are the same. We come from the same fire, the same resistance that spoke to civil rights and Black Power and now Black Lives Matter is the same fire that raised up Alcatraz and Wounded Knee and centuries before in both communities, the Underground Railroad. You can just kind of list a whole bunch of things. But the idea is that we are, all those who were not the original we, and even the descendants of they, need to be in solidarity together, because nobody gets healed till we're all healed. And so we all need to be working together to heal the nation.
Thank you. Thank you very much. That's very, very, very powerful. And I think as you were speaking, I thought of the contrast of the voices we bring as religious communities, and the contrast between this papal bull that we're discussing, the document, the doctrine of discovery, contrasted to Pope Francis's Laudate Si, in the care of our common home. Another resource we could explore this week as we prepare for worship on Sunday or engage this conversation, a real clarion call for the role of the church in the protection of this common home we have. And in that, he really does explore the legacy of the church and the religious communities that has been more compromised, and invites us to be able to acknowledge that. We also speak into a time of significant demographic shift, so that we, the people that started out, part of the tensions we're living with, and that the church has the opportunity to stand in the boundary to help heal, is this shift that's happening of power and presence in terms of these numbers. There is certainly a high level of anxiety, I think, among those who have held power to recognize this, the way that these demographic shifts are going to change the face of the nation. The question is, does that need to be a conflicting kind of trajectory in which it will lead to crisis and conflict, or can it become a much more collective view of the view? Certainly the image from Psalm 46 that Shona shared earlier of the city of God, where the river runs through, is one of an image of beauty, an image of collective possibility. I want to be mindful of our time. We do have a comment that came through from one of the listeners in the that I want to share very briefly. This is from David, who said, understanding the doctrine of discovery has been part of the church from the time of Papal Bull Romanus Pontifex, and folk like Vinny Deloria Jr. has called the church to learn and speak out about the doctrine of discovery since the early 1970s. Why are we only talking about it now in academia? A good question. I think definitely academic circles have engaged that at different periods. It's an opportunity for us to dust off the knowledge of that. It certainly has been central to many people's academic work, but perhaps what that question raises for us is, how effectively are we as educational institutions communicating the conversations we are having here on Holy Hill with our congregations and with our communities? That's part of the intent of these webinars, is to be able to kind of bring the conversation that we are having academically and otherwise around issues of social change into the lives of our congregations. And so we're grateful for your participation, those of you who are on the panel today, and for those of you who are listening to us today. I want to just say a couple of words as we conclude, and then give each of you a chance to do that as well. One quick update. I just got an email right now from Sharon Fenema, our faculty member, who was one of the folks detained at Standing Rock, and she's saying that she will be released later today, and so is anxious to reconnect with the rest of the group that were kind of scattered all over the place. For those of you who may know some of the folks in our community who were out there, they were detained in various locations as far out as Fargo, from Bismarck all the way to Fargo, and so they're hoping to reconnect with each other as they are released today. Again, we will be posting some of the materials and some of the resources that were named today. For those of you on the panel, if there are specific things that you would want us to post on there, please send them to me or to Aaron Burns or to Leslie, and we will make sure that they get posted on the website as valuable resources for folks who will be engaged in this conversation either this Sunday or in the days to come. I do want to encourage you, you'll see the details on our website as well at psr.edu, about details for tomorrow's day of action. So Standing Rock has asked for tomorrow to be a day of action, particularly at Army Corps of Engineers locations around the country. And there is an action that will be taking place right here in San Francisco early tomorrow, beginning with a prayer time and then an action before the Army Corps of Engineer office there. So details for that are on our website. A reminder that the Indigenous Environmental Network is probably one of the best websites to get up-to-date information and context on what is happening there. So let me invite each of you, maybe in the same order we did it at the beginning with Pat, then Mel, and Shauna, to sort of share just brief concluding comments that you would like to do.
Well, first I want to express my gratitude to PSR for doing these webinars. I think the more we can have conversations, the more we can move toward healing. And I would also just say that it's important, I think, for us to celebrate the victories as we have them so that we can stay encouraged, especially when people are feeling despondent about the election results. I think recognizing that there are so many places in our own communities and in the country and around the world where people are coming together and they're finding strength, courage, and power in working together to create the world that we want to live in for the generations to come. Because the impacts of what we're doing now will last for 7 generations.
Thank you. Thank you. And Mel?
I kind of laugh about all of this, and I keep hearing Donald Trump, President-elect Donald Trump, echo in my ears saying that he's building a wall. I don't think he realized the wall that he's building, the spiritual wall that he's building, and the people of God coming together and forming that wall. So yeah, I like the wall that's being built right now, and I'm in prayer for our nation. I'm in prayer for all those who are standing right now for various parts of the country and the world, but particularly for my cohort that's there, and Professor Fedema. My prayers are with them.
Thank you, Mel. And your comment makes me think of the First Peter's comment about we are living stones that come together to build something that brings together rather than divides us.
I think I'll just reiterate what I've suspected, and that was that Patricia and Mel and David have so many things to say that which parts of what they said today on this webinar might have an appearance in your worship, in your sermon. Let them be a sermon illustration. Let them speak. I think it's very powerful. So thank you.
Thank you, Shauna. An invitation as we conclude to one of the ways in which PSR will continue to engage this conversation, both the specifics of Standing Rock, but more broadly the discussions the connections we made today, is our Earl Lectures will be held in March 17th and 18th. And the title the theme for the lectures will be Borders and Identity. And so apropos to what Mel has just highlighted, raising the question about the fact that in a society where we are often defined by boundaries of race, of ethnicity, of culture, of gender, of religion, how do we redefine the idea of identity across those boundaries? As people live across those boundaries. And so we invite you into that conversation in March 17th and 18th. Our keynote speaker for that will be Jose Antonio Vargas, Pulitzer Prize winning journalist who, after a very successful career, came out as undocumented on the New York Times in an op-ed that he wrote. And so acknowledging the fact that how we define ourselves, how our identity is formed, needs to be challenged. And it is the work of our faith communities to do identity formation, to help us understand who we are. And as Patricia mentioned earlier, our understanding of God shapes our understanding of the world. And so theological conversations in our churches and our academic communities are hugely significant. So thank you all for your participation. I don't know, Leslie, if you have anything you want to say as we conclude here, details, but otherwise, I think we appreciate everyone's participation.
Great. And this webinar will be available on our website at ignitepsr.edu in the next hour.
Great. Thank you very much. So you have a good day and appreciate everyone's participation.
Thank you.
Thank you.